Well, hello and welcome inside the Parc Fermé for podcast number 680. It's what I'm calling F1's biggest challenges. That's right. This is Todd, aka Negative Camber. Oh boy, you know why I've asked you here.
You must convince the villagers that I'm harmless.
That's exactly what I need you to do. Tonight, for your kind consideration, we are going to be covering Formula One's biggest changes over the decades. That's according to us. But before doing that, of course, I have to introduce my guest tonight, which of course means... That's right, I gotta go all the way south to the Dallas-Fort Worth area where he plies his skills as a professional race car driver. Just the king of logistics. What can't this guy do, really, at this point? He is also the sporting director of Heart of Racing, the Aston Martin team in the IMSA series. You know him as the International. I lovingly call him Paul. Paul, how you doing it?
I'm good, yes. I guess when the TV screens are on, when people are watching this, I can't kind of sneak in and then oh my God, Paul just arrived.
He's just here.
Yeah, of course he is, Todd. He's been standing right next to you in the picture frame for about 3 minutes. Yeah. Maybe
I didn't whack
maybe we should just have an empty seat every
and
weekend.
You can just come rolling in.
Walk in, kind of like, like the Tonight Show or something.
Yeah, I like it. Just an empty camera view, and then you just come rolling in on your chair.
Oh, even better. Yeah. Like, was that guy from Austin Powers?
Yes.
Dr. Evil style.
Dr. Evil, exactly.
Yeah, very slowly, and then keep going, and then try and weasel my way back into the shot.
I like
What does it all mean, Basil?
It's perfect. So, Paul, you had what would you British call a stonking idea, right?
An epiphany, perhaps. I don't know. Yeah, it was just an idea. I just kind of come up today because we were searching for ideas because there's not a lot to talk about. Yeah. It was a sad little text that you said. I don't know what to talk about. There's nothing going on.
I never send those.
I have an idea.
I've got an idea. I never send those out. And I was trying to find some content. Okay, we kind of covered the COVID, the Austria, kind of covered that. And then you got, Ferrari saying, oh, we're not selling enough damn cars. Yeah, I mean, that's, everybody could say that, Mercedes, everybody else. And so I was thinking, I don't know. So I thought in my last ditch effort to uncover some news that I actually did find news that I was going to cover, but in defense of me. But I did send out an all hands on deck text to Paul and Grace, and Grace is very graciously taking the evening off because she deserves it. Damn it!
She does. She works all day.
She does. Apparently. She works
saving lives.
Saving lives.
Meaningful
exactly what
surveys.
Meaningful surveys.
Keeping people and keeping the cats entertained. She's busy.
She is busy. She's very busy. But Paul very graciously said, I've got an idea. And he said, why don't we talk about some of the biggest changes over the decades in Formula One? And we'll do it decade by decade. So we're going to go 1950s, 1960s, and all. You get the point.
Right. Basically, because obviously right now we're in a pretty significant part of Formula One, start off to 2020. So that's why it kind of came to mind anyway.
Yeah. So we thought now, Paul and I don't know what each other has picked. And there's a very good chance we've picked the same things. Although Paul did say, okay, let's pick a couple things from each decade.
Right.
That way, in case we pick the same thing, it like the 60s, of course, we're going to say aerodynamics. And so, but I've chosen a couple different things, and I tried to anticipate what I think Paul would answer.
Never a good idea.
Never a good idea, because he may come up with 1961 and a half left foot braking was really perfected by, Rodriguez brothers or something.
How the Sex Pistols influenced Formula One in 1976.
I know, and I would have gotten to the 90s when REM sold out. So that's what I do. Yeah. So anyway, I have chosen mine. Paul has chosen his. Yes. Let's compare notes, shall we?
Let's do it.
Let's get technical. I'm not going to get way into the weeds on this thing.
Yeah, we don't. We're not smart enough for that.
I'm not an engineer. I'm not going to get in the weeds on this thing, but maybe these topics will prompt you to go out and do a little research on them. And for you veterans that have known it, and you veterans that are engineering minded, you may, you'll recall this and say, oh yeah, I remember that. That was so great when they did that. Great. You may know the equations. So yeah. Anyway, I'm not going to get technical for our newer viewers. So anyway,
it's fun.
Yeah, it was just fun. No doubt. The Formula One series has gone through massive changes since its inception. But in the last 50 or 60 years, there have been some huge innovations in Formula One that it really has driven to where we are now. You could draw a line from where we are now all the way back to the 1950s and see the knock-on effect of innovation and technology evolution that has put us in the position that we're in today. Very much so.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about some of these things. But what were the biggest changes of the sport? What were the biggest changes it faced in that 50 or 60 year time frame? What elements came into the sport that were some of the biggest changing moments in the sport's history, which were so big that they actually changed the DNA of the sport? Oftentimes you'll hear team bosses say, well, we can change these regulations, Ross, but we can't change the DNA of F1. Well, it's been a changing DNA for a long time.
Times. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So what is the DNA of Formula One? Well, some of these changes might prompt or help you understand that a little better, or at least we hope they do. Yeah. Tonight, we're going to try to offer a list of which elements through the decades that we feel shaped the sport that we love. And we would love, it goes without saying, folks, we would love your list too. I'm sure there's many things, well, I know there is many things that I could have chosen along with the list of the two things that I chose. And you'll be thinking of some of these. So please share those in the comment section of this podcast at the website, theparcfermé.com. Okay, Paul, we're going to start off 1950s.
Right.
Let's do it. Yes.
Not good enough, damn it. Not good enough.
All right, here we go. 1950s. What was your first choice for the element that impacted or changed Formula One?
Italy. Basically, it was Italy versus Italy versus Italy.
Yeah, it was.
The ninth.
Fangio, Farina.
Yeah. Fangio was Argentinian, but he was driving. Obviously, we had Maserati, we had Ferrari, we had Alfa Romeo. Lancia. I mean, just right. and most of the drivers were Italian except for Fangio, right? He was kind of like an adopted Italian to some degree. I don't know how he made his way out of there, but I mean, they just dominated the DNA of F1 at the beginning and through the sport. Obviously, had a little interspersion of Mercedes there. They came with the might of Germany from 54 to 55, but then during that incident at Le Mans in 55, basically Mercedes came, dominated, then they left quickly and left the Italians behind again. So I just think the Italians just had a massive influence in the beginning of Formula One, and as we see here, it still has a massive influence on Formula One, all these many decades later. I did find a fun fact when I was looking though, but did you know that the motorbikes actually were the first motorsport to have a world championship in 1949, and that's what prompted Formula One to begin a world championship in 1950.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know that. Was a bunch of Augustas and stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess obviously MotoGP and Formula One are kind of rivalries now, and back then, the actual motorbikes are the first ones to lump down and actually start to categorize and count points for races and all that kind of stuff in 49. So F1 didn't want to be left behind in the dust. So that's why they started the F1 World Championship.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Good. Yeah.
Excellent. My first one I picked were the engines. In the 1950s, it was all about the engine.
Right. So it wasn't about the handling.
No. It wasn't about the handling or the aerodynamics, for sure.
No, right.
It was all about the engine.
All the safety. Yeah.
Definitely not safety. You had Juan Fangio, driving around in a light summer cotton polo shirt.
Yes,
right out loud.
Big wheel.
Yeah, the big wheel, and he had that light, shirt on. So this begat the comment from Enzo that aerodynamics are for people who can't build good engines, right? This comes out of that era in the 50s, 60s. And certainly it was all about the engine. The engine was in the front originally for much of the 50s until Jack changed all that, right? And put it behind him. and they were all similar in the fact that they were in the front, but under the hood, they were all radically different from team to team. The engines were limited to 4.5 liters, and then
a lot of power.
A tremendous amount. They were supercharged.
Think about how much power we have now, and how much back then. They were like 450 horsepower engines in skinny tires with just basically carriages for chassis.
That's right.
I mean, the speeds those guys did, the power they were trying to control at that time, I just can't even imagine it, quite honestly. Even street cars, you buy a street car with 450 horsepower, that's a pretty fast car, right? And that's with all the sophisticated suspension, the tires and everything. Back then, basically a crate with a big motor on the front, 450 horsepower, and see you when you get home.
Yeah, they were 4.5 liters. They were the supercharged engines limited to 1.5 liters, but they were doing supercharged compressed air in there. The other big innovation was the race for better engines during the 50s. It was huge. More shove, more horsepower, but BRM's 16-cylinder, 525 horsepower at 10,500 RPM. That was a monster, Paul.
Yeah, can you imagine? They're probably obviously too afraid to rev them that high nowadays in this story, even if you see a little demonstration. But man, that's awesome, isn't it? That is something. The tire technology was way behind the power, obviously, right? They do skinny treaded tires, and you read all the reports from the races, and a lot of times they had to come in because they were basically wearing their tires out, and even I'd probably wear those tires out in one lap, I would think. I mean, they must have been driving on eggshells with that throttle pedal. That's all I can tell you.
No doubt. And then you also had engine innovation with you mentioned Mercedes, Paul. They really innovated with Bosch at the time, and they pretty much put the death to the carburetor during this era with direct injection technology. And that, Paul, was quickly replaced by indirect manifold injection technology pretty quickly. But suffice it to say, the 50s and then early 60s, there was no carburetors left. It was all direct injection at that point.
Just in NASCAR.
Yeah, right. Just in NASCAR, but in Formula One, not talking about NASCAR, but in Formula One, we're talking about 1950s, folks. Direct injection is when that came in. Also, Paul, there was no limit on the fuel types due to the pressure and heat these engines were working under, and some were running at this time 130 octane airplane fuel.
Man.
And it was Shell back in the 50s, our friends at Shell, that lobbied the sport to use more conventional fuel that fans could relate to, meaning more road relevant fuel. Now, it took several years. It wasn't until much later that they got there, but they were moving in that direction. And I read this piece about Mercedes' cocktail of fuel that they were using even back in the 50s. Up until the end of 57, you could use whatever you wanted to. Mercedes, their recipe for fuel was 45% benzene, 25% methyl alcohol, 23% aviation fuel, 3% acetone, 2% nitrobenzene, and the remaining 2% was an absolute mystery, a secret, and may still be to this day. The mixture was, exactly. The mixture was so toxic, the fuel left over from training or practicing and races and stuff like that had to be drained off, and then the engine had to be rinsed out with conventional petrol. And this was the only way to prevent the engine from suffering massive damage overnight. That was the Mercedes recipe.
And race cars still do that. They don't leave fuel in the cars. That stuff still has some things to be controlled. And back then, obviously they started off, I think the first championship was 7 races. It ebbed and flowed a little bit with how many races, but the most races in any season during the 1950s was 10.
Right.
So,
right.
When we go back in history, you definitely, obviously there's more than 20 nowadays. So you can see that evolution as well.
What was the other thing you picked for the 50s? I'm curious.
No, that was it.
That was it?
The Italians, Germany versus Fangio.
Excuse me.
Yeah, that was it.
I also picked disc brakes.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Now, was that Formula One or was that? Because I know Jaguar was the first car to have disc brakes in Le Mans. When did they have disc brakes in Formula One?
Right. So up until 1955, the cars used drum brakes. It was the British Connaught team that took victory first with a disc brake with the dentist, Tony Brooks, your friend, winning in Italy with a disc brake. But it was several years later before the entire field had made that changeover. And to your point, Paul, eventually late 50s, Ferrari took the disc brakes off their sports cars that they were racing and put it on their Formula One car and ran it in Formula One.
There you go.
So disc brake innovation in the 1950s. So the Italians,
more you know.
Incredibly dominant, Alfa Romeo, Ascari, Fagiolo, all of these guys, incredible race car drivers, Italian influence for sure. They had their foot on the neck of Formula One at that point. But some British innovation coming in there with engine development, BRM and the 16-cylinder, the Connaught team and disc brakes, this British ingenuity coming into the sport. Very, very impactful of that sport, and move that and advance that sport in the 50s forward. So
right. That comes into play once we get to the 60s also.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. This is really where the British post-war were really coming on strong in the innovation and development. So let's move to the 1960s. When you got into the 1960s, Paul, what was your thing that you chose?
I mean, it kind of came in late, but aerodynamics, I mean, the impact that it had, it was late in the 60s, said 68, I think.
Yep, 68.
Where it was debuted by Lotus at Monaco, Graham Hill, and he instantly got pole and instantly won the first race. Then after that, Ferrari, the next race, they went to Spa, and Ferrari implemented some wings. And then they had Chris Amon and Jack Ickx were teammates, and Amon had the aerofoils on front and back, obviously to balance the car out. Ickx did not, and Amon was like 6 seconds a lap faster than Ickx, just by the dominance that the aerodynamics had. And then by the third race, which was the Dutch Grand Prix, everyone had some kind of rear and front wing balance. And then it got all crazy where they had, you've seen the pictures with the big stilts hanging off the back of the car because they wanted to get clean air to work that rear wing. But then those started folding over and causing big incidents. So then the rules started to dictate where that wing could be. But just a massive, massive difference. We'd seen at this point, everything was evolution, right? They've gained a little speed, they massaged this, etc. But as soon as they put wings on the front and the back of those cars, the cars went so much faster. Just so as they saw at Indianapolis, it was just, slam dunk. You just can't go back anymore. Right. And so I think that had a massive influence on speed back then. Maybe the cars weren't safe enough to handle that speed, but then obviously to this day, that DNA is definitely visual in every car.
Yeah. Huge impact of the sport. I knew you would pick aerodynamics, so I tried to find a couple things that maybe you didn't pick. Okay. My first one was moving from the tried and true space frame to a monocoque. So the monocoque was a huge innovation. So just as Jack Brabham had moved the sport from a front engine to a rear engine format in the late 50s, Jack came out with that. Colin Chapman, mastermind behind Lotus, moved the sport from the space frame tube and space frame construction to the aluminum, or as you might call it, Paul, aluminium.
Yes, if you spell it right, Todd, you'll pronounce it right.
Yeah, right. So they moved that to a monocoque, which was basically, Paul, these assembled and welded, aluminum boxes, basically, was this monocoque design. And this design with the Lotus 25 back in 1962 completely revolutionized the sport, just as Paul's aerodynamics did. How effective was the aluminium box concept? Well, Graham Hill won the 62 title in the Lotus 25 as soon as it released. I mean, it was a done deal, like the aerodynamics.
Right, and then they evolved once they got the DFV to make the engine and monocoque, the engine a stress member of the monocoque.
That's right. I put that the design was innovative and that the engine became a stress component of the chassis, and the mounting points improved the torsional rigidity of the whole thing. When they did that, it was revolutionary.
Yep. Instead of the engine sitting in a little cage in the back, it was literally a part of the whole monocoque car design. Just one thing on the aerodynamics. Where did they get the idea for putting wings on the cars, and it actually came from Texas, my home state.
Was it Chaparral?
It was a Chaparral 2F, yeah.
All right.
And
All right.
and then I looked a little bit more into it, and I was horrified to know that the first time they put wings on something, it was a DRS wing, because it was a movable device. So they could flatten the wing out in the straights and then let it pop back up. So I don't know. Do I have an argument left anymore? I mean, DRS was an integral part of the sport from the very beginning.
Right. It was DRS.
Not good enough, damn it. Not good enough.
That's not good.
Isn't that sad? But
it
obviously they didn't allow. I think maybe they allowed it just a smidge in Formula One, but that quickly got banned.
But that banned Chaparral, quickly.
Yeah. So it had to be a fixed wing concept, but that's
right.
where it came from, right? From Texas.
Right. Exactly. So I knew Paul would take aerodynamics, and for all the right reasons, it must be said. I thought also in that same year, Paul, 1968, when your aerodynamics came into the sport, revolutionized the sport just like the monocoque did earlier in 62. But in that same year, 1968, something also happened. Something that had not been seen on the cars before.
Sponsorship.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
1968, first stickers and sponsors showed up. It was Gold Leaf, was it not? In a Lotus 49?
I believe it was. Yeah.
So that revolutionized the sport. And it had to, Paul. It had to, because the technology evolution was advancing so quickly that this advertising, selling space on this car, allowed these teams really to get the kind of title sponsorship this, begat the Vodafone, McLaren, Marlboro, Ferrari era. This evolved into a multi-billion dollar industry, and it put multiple millions of dollars that were infused into the series via these team sponsorships. So the sport itself just started to explode. They had young driver development with Marlboro. Marlboro's involvement alone, Paul, as you know, firsthand, was massive. And it's still a huge part of this today. You remember that in the 80s, the Marlboro, what impact and influence they had on the sport?
Marlboro, Camel, every cigarette league was. Yeah. I mean, it kind of evolved to the professional driver by that point, right? Because before the 50s, you'd have gentleman drivers, most of them affluent. Right. You had some drivers, car owners that were affluent and they could pay for it themselves. So there's a smattering of professional drivers like Fangio and Moss and everything like that, but a majority of the field were made up of gentleman drivers who were kind of paying for themselves to go there. As soon as they opened up sponsorship and the team started to be able to get money in, then they need to deliver results, and to do that they needed the best driver they could get. So it kind of started evolving the professional driver programs, as you talked about, so the whole grid was now full of athlete professionals rather than gentleman sportsmen as well, which is still carries on in sports car racing, but definitely not much of a part of Formula One from there on out.
Right.
Yeah, it was also the emergence of the independent teams like the Garagistas, right? We know that's right. In the 50s we saw the Alphas and the Ferraris, etc. But this became the point in the 60s where the independent teams, mostly from England, were actually able to flourish and be successful. And it was a new way of going about racing. And so it once again evolved the DNA where we ended up with the Williams teams and the McLarens and the Brabhams, and all this kind of stuff kind of evolved and grew bigger as the 60s went on.
Right. So those were the big ones. Certainly aerodynamics, the monocoque, sponsorship in the 60s. All of these were huge. It also gave birth to my probably all-time favorite Formula One car, the Lotus 49. So fantastic era. Let's move to the 1970s when Paul used to have a goody comb in his back pocket, bell bottoms, huge collars on his silk shirts.
Yeah, you betcha.
And platform shoes.
Because in the 70s, I was a 28-year-old man, evidently. Because that's what I was doing. Yeah, I was at the disco all the time.
That's exactly what you were doing.
I was actually a small child, Todd.
But you still wore platform shoes.
Never did. My sister did.
There you go.
My sister did for sure. She was a queen of the 70s. But
Yes.
Yeah, I was kind of on the edge there at the end. So I saw it all happen for me.
Oh
You know,
yeah.
it was there. You know, the
Yeah.
JPS girls going away giving cigarettes to every kid that walked by. It was an interesting time. You
You
know,
were an
for young.
impressionable young youth.
Yes, and there was a lot of stuff going on that I didn't really understand it, but it was stuff going on.
Hey. So the 1970s, Paul, what was the element you chose?
This was a tougher one for me.
Mm.
I got a couple, so let me pick. I'm gonna pick Bernie Ecclestone.
Okay.
Because your camera went off or something.
I know. I was button pushing over here. Periodically, that will happen.
That's okay. Good. What's going to come in front of me when I push a button? Something cool?
I don't think so.
No,
when I push my button over here, it reverts back to our logo.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, as
Yours
long as
does not.
No, it doesn't. I don't even know what button to push actually. So we'll just skip that. So I'm going to go with Bernie Ecclestone because Bernie, obviously, from there on out, he gained control of Formula One.
Yep.
He evolved into being a team owner, to then being a constructor, and one of the people squawking, to basically taking over the sport by the end of the 70s. So I think what Bernie did then, definitely carried on for decades on afterwards. So I mean, I'll wait to see what you picked, but that was kind of like what had the biggest impact. I think Bernie Ecclestone did.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do have mention of Bernard Charles Ecclestone, but I have it a little later. So 1970s. Well, first I have to give honorable mention to turbos and to the DFV.
Okay.
But that's not the ones I chose. I chose managing air.
Okay. So ground effect.
I had ground effects as one of my choices. I'll get into that after I discuss this.
Okay.
Managing air. If you look at all the cars from 1950 through 1969, you will see that all of them had openings in their noses. And this was the only way that the designers had to get air needed for cooling as well as combustion back into the car.
Okay.
But when you look at the car that started my lifelong love of F1, the Lotus 72, you will notice that there is no hole in the nose.
Right, just a flat nose.
It is a closed wedge, and that's because Colin Chapman figured out a way to get air into his car in a different way, and thus gave birth to the side pods. And they were created, and this allowed the Lotus 72 to go, Paul, 14 kilometers an hour faster than his previous car with the same engine.
Wow.
That was how radical that change was, going from nose opening to side pods.
Huh.
It's amazing,
Very nice.
isn't it?
That is. That's crazy.
Yeah. Just amazing. Which is a complete knock-on to ground effect.
Right. Ground effect, which came out when Colin Chapman with the Lotus 78.
Lotus 78.
Yep. In 1977, right? Is that
I believe that was right. The Lotus 78.
77. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was groundbreaking design, straight out of the wind tunnel. They had the strips along the side that went all the way down to the asphalt,
skirts,
right? The skirts, and then it was basically a legal trick that they did. They could drive that air. The air flowing underneath the Lotus 78 was accelerated so much to the extent that it literally created suction, and that held the car to the ground, thus enabling corner speeds at phenomenal rates, right?
Yeah.
So the difference being, in today's era, the aerodynamic magic is pushing the car down into the tarmac like a wing. It's pushing an upside down wing. It's pushing the car down in the tarmac with over twice the actual weight of the Formula One car. Back then, it was the opposite. It was sucking air underneath the car at such a rapid that it created a suction and it sucked the car down. Right?
Yeah. And it's interesting how that works. And that made the actual chassis even more important, because what you found out, the 78 was the one that innovated the idea, but it wasn't perfect Then they went through the Lotus 79. And then after that, everyone kind of saw the idea, copied it, and actually did it a little better, because Colin Chapman built a bit of a flexi work at that point. I mean, every year they're trying to make the cars stiffer and stiffer.
And the Brabham, wasn't the Brabham had their sort of
the fan car?
Yeah, but it was the Parmalat. What am I thinking? Which one? Or is I'm thinking BRM? Which one am I thinking that?
I don't know.
Parmalat car.
Well, Parmalat was a Brabham.
Yeah, the Brabham.
Brabham was a fan car.
But before the fan car, they had like no. I think they did that too. The engines were overheating constantly. They were like boiling back there.
It was an Alfa Romeo, so.
Right. I have to think. I can't remember the model anyway. But I remember they were trying some ground effect, back then before the fan car. That was really, was that Gordon? I can't remember, but it was.
Yeah, Gordon was from 73 onwards at Brabham. So he did one of my favorite cars, the BT44. The Martini Brabham and all that kind of good stuff. And so I mean, and everyone, once again, everything ramped up. It's kind of like when aerodynamic wings came on cars, then everyone copied, then everyone got better at it, and certain people were better than others. And so basically Colin got the advantage of his innovation just for 2 years. After that, everyone actually passed him in how to make the best use of the ground effects. So that's when the Ligiers came out, and the Williams cars got better and better as they were in perfecting his original idea. And Lotus kind of lost the plot a little bit, or didn't anticipate how quickly the other teams would understand the effects and accelerate the innovation.
Right.
So,
and honorable mentions go to the P34.
Yes, absolutely. That's on my list. Got to be. I mean, it was just fun, right? I mean, back then, the cars, you could paint them all white, but you'd know exactly what car it was. At least I would.
Right.
I actually took a quiz on that F1.com about that, and the 70s, man, I nailed every car. Complete white, right? From the Brabhams to the six-wheel Tyrrell, everything was unique. Now everything you couldn't probably tell pretty much, but it was so fun to know what was going to come out. The teapot Ligier, I mean, it's just just all kinds of stuff. And maybe they didn't really have great resources for the aerodynamics, the wind tunnels, etc. So some of it was guesswork, and so that's why the different designs are so radically different from one to the next. Now we're really pigeonholed into a little box here, but back then, just every year, every car was so different. That's why the car launches are so exciting to see, because you didn't know what was going to come up next. After the six-wheel Tyrrell, all bets were off. We just didn't know what was going to happen.
You had fan car, you had all this crazy innovation.
Yeah, it was great stuff. So
the arrows, no wings, no front wing.
Yeah, I mean that. I was a big Arrows fan, right?
Yeah.
And that was the A2 that came out.
The A2. That's it.
Yeah, that came out, and to find out, I think I read it in Motorsport as to why that car didn't work, because it looked like it was completely making the most of that whole concept. But once again, it came back to the chassis, where the chassis wasn't stiff enough to be able to hold the loads. So it was twisting, and so there was, inconsistent downforce, and that led to a car that you can't get the most out of, right? So, every box has to be ticked, and the ground effects, how much pressure it was building up, and how much really it was sucking that car down, was something the team's chassis designs couldn't quite keep up with originally.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember now. You talk about the torsional rigidity of those chassis. I was trying to remember now. I don't know if it was the 90s. Maybe it was the 80s. May have been Colin Chapman that created like the dual chassis, the chassis inside of the chassis.
Right.
Where the regulations where the chassis couldn't do this, but he had the twin chassis where there was a softer, more compliant chassis out inside of a more rigid.
Right. And the car would come down. Yeah, it was kind of like
it didn't work.
They don't really know. They never raced it.
Right.
It was banned before they raced it.
But it sucked a lot of R&D dollars out of Lotus.
Yeah, it did, and put them behind for a couple of years, right?
Yeah.
So
they rolled the dice, and
the only other thing I had in the 70s was Niki Lauda. I mean, he up until obviously he died, he was still involved, and he touched Formula One for many decades, and he was a massive influence on the sport, but also on how a driver behaves within the sport. Right. I mean, he kind of set a standard of, you know, making a little aggro in the teams and trying to, you know, get everything to slide more to his direction, no matter what team he was in and who his teammate was. So, yeah, I think he changed that. Everyone was gentleman drivers in, oh, you know, you go ahead. No, Sterling, no, you go ahead. You know, till Nicky Lauda comes and like, you know, this is bullshit time. I want to win, right? So there he
crazy.
That's right. All right, let's slide into the 1980s when you and I, being the novel Gen X that we are, our formative,
our decade,
youthful years in the 80s,
where he made the adults mad at us.
Yes, we were the latchkey children, Paul.
Yeah, we were the Lando Norrises of the 80s. No, we weren't.
Yeah, we didn't act like that.
No.
But all right, so I'm pretty sure I know which one you've chosen for the 80s. It's a biggie. I'll be surprised if you didn't.
Okay.
But what did you choose?
Turbo Mania. And
oh, interesting. Okay.
The chase for horsepower.
Yes.
You know, I mean, I know you mentioned, I've actually got a couple, but you mentioned turbos a little bit because they they started showing what they were capable of right at the end of the 70s, but in the 80s it just went nuts. Right. I mean, that's when in 82 they abolished ground effect cars, made a flat bottom, but they kept the engines evolving. And then you know, we had the qualifying specials when you had the BMWs and the Ferraris, everything turned up to like 1200 horsepower, and that's when you're seeing, you know, the guys like Senna and Prost and everyone just wrestling these things. I mean, we're talking about in the 50s with the 450 horsepower. Well, this was maybe nearly the same, you know, walk at eggshells on the throttle, at qualifying tires, you know, to make the most of all the power. There was no way you could use all the power those cars are capable of on a race tire. So then they came out with qualifying tires that could really maximize what those cars are capable of. So qualifying tires, 1200, 1500 horsepower maybe in those cars at some time. Just
insane,
obscene amounts. I know I told you the story before, but you know, my brother was working for Brabham, and that was in this era. And they only had like a little 2-liter engine, right? I think a small little, based on a street engine, and somehow they've created this monster with the turbos to be like 1500. But you know, those engine blocks had that withstand that. They were changing engines very frequently, but they wanted them at least to last long enough to be able to qualify on or race on. And he said, yeah, they put, whether it was a real thing or not, but they put these blocks from the street cars out in the back of the garage at Brabham, and they'd basically go and urinate on them and just treat them like horrible, and all through the winter. And supposedly that was some kind of trick to making these engine blocks be able to take all the power. I don't know, maybe they just needed to go for a pee and they didn't want to pay for a bathroom, but that was a truism that they did. It was some kind of methodology, and then they'd be rusty and probably stinky, and then they'd then clean the engines up and build these amazing 1500 brake horsepower engines.
That's awesome. That was the turbo just got crazy insane. Man. What was your other thing from the 80s?
McLaren, Ron Dennis, changing the way a Formula One team goes about its business.
Right.
He took over McLaren. Being 84, was it?
Nice, Ron.
Yes.
And he had Project 4 and took over McLaren. And just went about the business of cleaning up the team. Everyone was smart. There was procedures in place. You know, just completely different from how everyone was going about racing then, with their shorts and their floppy hair and whatever. But he'd basically changed, and his success made everybody else follow how F1 teams we see now today, with how everything is just buttoned up and procedures and everything's clean to a, you know, it's just completely changed about how teams go about racing.
Right. Yeah.
What did you think I was going to say?
I thought you were going to say carbon fiber.
Well, yeah.
Ron Dennis.
There you go. Ron Dennis. That's right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it was, in fairness, carbon fiber coming into the sport was a massive, massive change. And in fairness, it was Ron Dennis, but it was also Lotus that did it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
They both did.
They both led the way. Greater torsional rigidity, safer, much lighter. What's not to like about carbon fiber? They were the first ones to do it.
Right.
And they brought it into Formula One.
It's a good story. Yeah, I don't know who did it for Lotus. I know Hercules in the US were the people that built the original, and for a while were in charge of basically baking and helping, build this whole carbon fiber.
They had the whole autoclave
chassis.
And everything. They
did,
so
the chassis had to be built or created in California, I think Hercules.
Right.
And John Barnard wasn't he jumping back and forth with IndyCar and stuff? And I think that's how he met the Hercules people and how that idea came to him, I think.
Yeah. So carbon fiber, a big one. The other one that I had for the 1980s that radically impacted the sport, you alluded to it earlier, in the 70s, was the FISA-FOCA war.
Right.
And basically they took over Formula One at this point. It'd been simmering, as you suggested, since the late 70s, but the wresting of control of the sport was the single biggest element of the 80s that radically changed the direction of the sport. The advance, and the reason for this, as you had mentioned, the reason for this was the advancing technology was evolving so quickly in Formula One that the teams couldn't afford it if they wanted to remain competitive. And in order to remain competitive, that sponsorship that I mentioned, it got huge in the 80s.
Yeah.
And the teams needed the cash. And Bernie Eccleston was the one that led this. And it was down to him. He was the guy with Max Mosley that wrested control of the sport away from FISA and brought it to the teams, because the teams needed the cash to develop that technology evolution. That migration path with technology was so steep that they had to have that. And this all culminated, Paul, you recall, in the boycott of the South African Grand Prix in 1982, which saw basically the taking over of Formula One, and then the sponsorship and the infusion of cash into these teams to allow them to grow.
Very good.
Yeah, huge. Let's see. Shall we move to 1990s? Let's.
Sure.
The 1990s, your first element for the 1990s?
But I mean, and it's a bit poignant now. Obviously, this weekend, I think, was it May 1st, that we lost Senna and Ratzenberger at the Mola, and that started the big drive for safety. So obviously, the shock first is, how could Senna be dead?
Right.
And then the shock waves that reverberated after that just never seemed to stop, quite honestly. I mean, obviously they fiddled with the track design to try and get the races on and still be safe, but then the pursuit of extra safety, and basically safety came first after that, it felt like. Right?
Yeah, you could argue, I guess, Paul, that all that hard work that Jackie Stewart had done on the behalf of safety was originally met with serious pushback.
Right.
And he had chipped away over the years and brought in safety, and it was slowly adopting. But that galvanizing in 94 made safety completely the focus at that point.
Right, because it came to a certain point. I mean, there was a time where drivers are dying more frequently, so a driver dying didn't have as big an impact. And we'd been quite a while, I think, before a driver died. So I think everyone was kind of like, oh, well, we've got it all figured out. But then obviously that weekend was just a very dark, black weekend for whatever reason. I just don't understand it, but it was a crazy weekend with crashes and Barrichello crashing. There was a crash on the start line. There was a crash before with Roland Ratzenberger, and there's obviously the crash with Senna a few laps into the race. So, and it just changed everything, and everyone, safety first, kind of like what we're dealing with now, right? Everything was thrown away. We don't care what else happens, but we got to start making these cars and races safer.
Yeah. My first pick was active suspension.
Yeah, that's on my list too. Yeah.
Is it? Yeah. Active suspension.
Short-lived, but
Yeah. So it was the Williams Renault FW14B. They had absolute dominance at the point when they were running it. They equipped the cars with active chassis and active suspension, and it originated from the 80s and then kind of got perfected. It was all computer controlled. The chassis adapted itself to whatever the driving conditions were out there. Traction control automatically, prevented the wheel spin when accelerating. And basically, they dominated. Mansell drove to victory after victory after victory in this thing, and it was just unbeatable what Williams had done. Yeah, it was amazing.
And your favorite Williams chief engineer there, Paddy, was in charge of that, if you believe.
That's right. That's exactly right. Sir Frank Loving Life at that point was dominating everything, and Patrick Head doing it was great. It was fantastic. So that was a big one. My second one was really basically the fuel. The craziness of the fuel at that time. I did an interview a few years ago with Guy Lovett, the on track main guy for Shell and Ferrari's fuel at the Shell lab and everything. Before Guy's boss, I interviewed him a few years ago when he was around during the crazy cocktail fuel era. But the new regulations came in that forced the fuel in Formula One to be a little more standardized. Aside from nitrogen and oxygen, the fuel only allowed it was only allowed to contain hydrocarbons, alcohol, nitrogen compounds, and other that other sort of horsepower friendly additives. They were all disallowed at that point.
Right. Yeah, I remember hearing stories when they did an engine fire up, and if you were standing behind the car, even the fans, literally, it's like you've been gassed, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So they mandated at that time, though, in the 90s, that the fuel had to comply with all health and safety rules of the European Union. And with that one move, that, folks, was officially, that opened the way to gas station petrol in Formula One. And that was it from that point on. Yeah. And so anyway, and that, technically, you remember there was a commercial and I remember Ferrari did a video. You can see it on YouTube where they went and put in regular road fuel and then tested the Ferrari, and it wasn't that far off.
No, it wasn't. Yeah, that's right. That's true.
From its performance. So that
is true.
Cool innovation.
Well, I got one more on that. So I got Mansell to IndyCar.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
That was a massive story. Obviously, Mansell, as you talked about, dominated in the Williams. And then the next year, for whatever reason, I can't remember if it was contracts or whatever, he decided to quit Formula One and he moved to IndyCar. And obviously, that was a massive story. Huge. He ended up winning the championship. He did an amazing job because it's not easy to jump from Formula One to jump to the cars that do the ovals, the short ovals, the road courses, street course. But Mansell, it was nearly an ideal kind of car for Mansell to drive, quite honestly. But also I was thinking about IndyCar versus Formula One at that time. IndyCar,
Champ Car,
IndyCar. It was rivaling Formula One in popularity. So there was a battle going on there, quite honestly. It was the heyday years for IndyCar, unlike
I loved it.
sim race heyday we've got right now with our buddy Santino Ferrucci and all that kind of disaster. It's just
Pagano and Lamb.
Oh my God!
People just need to chill on the whole damn thing. I'm sorry.
Oh my God!
Everybody
you're probably just sitting back there going, "Told you so."
That's exactly what I was saying.
I didn't want to get into it because it was an absolute. They made it a complete joke. It doesn't have to be a joke, but man.
They made it a joke, and then everybody overreacting, and it's not a game. There's people that are serious. I get it.
Yeah.
There is people who are in the esports world that have monetized it, that have sponsors, and it's a great thing. And all more power to them. But professional drivers aren't them.
No.
They are professional, real drivers who have real sponsorships and serious money and salaries. This is not their world. So if you're trying to say that it is, and it's officially sanctioned, the whole thing is BS. If I was a professional driver, I wouldn't touch a sim race with a 10-foot pole.
Well, there's some that didn't want to, but I think they were obligated, quite honestly. People like Rossi
And you
and
go
some
in
other
there
people,
and you phone it in, chuck it.
Yeah, right.
So
but I was,
I wouldn't do it.
Santino thing. I mean, he used to be a sim race sponsored driver, so I met him a few times. So he's been involved in sim racing since he was a little kid.
Yeah.
So pretty disappointed in him treating it like that. Because people are trying to replace real racing, and then as soon as you do something like that, once again you're back to what you don't like. Is I don't really have any interest in watching someone else play a video game, which is what they all brought it down to. And it was just a ridiculous. I mean, they just destroyed whatever weight they were trying to build up, or illusion, or whatever you want to call it. But
just a note for Formula One: just stop. Just stop it. This is silly. What I would much rather do is what Sky Sports, and kudos to Brundle and all the people at Sky, the whole team at Sky Sports are doing fabulous content. They'll go back and replay a race like the one they did with JB. And so they had JB come on. He won the race. It was his first race with Honda. Huge. So they had JB come on and watch the race with him, and they commentated.
And there's so much racing in the history that we're not going to run out of good races to watch, right? And not everyone's watched every Formula One race that existed, so there's always something new to see, So
absolutely, and they can come in. It's casual. They don't have to call color commentary for every lap. They can come in and they can segue into different comments and about the technology with the drivers, or they had Shovon and JB, and they talked about the tech. They talked about the driver. That is what we should be doing, because all of the newer fans of Formula One have not watched those races and can really emotionally get invested in the series like you and I were when it was actually happening. Right. That's what they should be doing instead of sitting around playing a damn video game.
Yeah, I agree with you there. There's so much stuff that we could be entertained by and informed with.
Oh my gosh!
Past races and all these people sitting around. Once again, they're still doing nothing, right?
Yeah. And you've got Formula One has people. They have Will Buxton, who would be fabulous at it. Jason Swells, those guys that would be fabulous at setting this up or working with Sky Sports in conjunction with. But anyway, don't get me on my rant. All right. Let's move to the 2000s, shall we? Your first element. Now don't start with me. What Schumacher and Ferrari pulled off was some kind of awesome in the 2000s. But it also begat the awesomeness of Renault and Fernando Alonso, which was awesome in its own right. So
true. I mean, I always say it. I don't mind dominance because I love how eventually someone's gonna beat them. Right. So I don't want Mercedes to be, tie their shoelaces together so people think someone else has no chance to win. You earn that win, and that's exactly what happened. I mean, basically Ferrari were a super team. Ross Brawn, Jean Todt, Michael Schumacher. I mean, the engineers, the designers, Rory Byrne. I mean, just a super team that did what a super team would do, and they dominated the sport. And it was something to be seen about it. I mean, the cars were awesome. The dominance was amazing.
I wrote
it wasn't the most interesting thing to watch half the time, but
I wrote an editorial a few years ago when everybody's like, Adrian Newey is unbeatable, and I went, no. There's a chap, Rory beat him.
Yeah,
beat him in his own damn game, and it's. I wish somebody would unpack that and write a really cool book about what Rory did to beat Adrian Newey to his own aerodynamic chassis development.
Right.
I think there's a story there. I do.
Yeah.
I think it's a Rory, markedly different guy than Adrian Newey. And it's such a neat, interesting story in South Africa.
Right, and still involved, right? I think.
Yeah, I think maybe in consulting role or something. He lives in Taiwan, I think maybe.
Does he?
Yeah. Interesting character, Rory Byrne.
Yeah. So Ferrari's super team was Schumacher, obviously 5 straight titles was the massive thing. The other couple of things was obviously the emergence of Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah.
That's where he came in to the sport. Won his championship. Fernando. So, but Lewis, I feel, just for what's happened since then, right?
5-time champ, 6-time champ.
I mean, Alonso was amazing back then. I mean, you remember that, Alonso just piling that Renault into the corners was just
oh my gosh,
amazing. But Lewis coming in, nearly winning the championship in his first year, winning it in the second. And then, the rest of his life is history, but
unbelievable.
This is where he came in. And then Braun GP, obviously at the end of the 2000s, started what we now see is the Mercedes dominance there on after.
That's right. Yeah. That was one of mine, the dual diffuser.
Yeah.
The challenge was the regulations had been written to reduce the aero down by 50% that year. And when the teams tried to design new wings of the new regulations, every time they put new designs on the front wings, they'd stall the diffuser, Paul, every single time. They're like, well, what the heck are we going to do? We literally are going to be 50% down, or we got to do something. And so Braun and a couple other teams, they came up and said, well, what if we did a dual diffuser? And when they stuck that on, no matter what they did with the front wing, that car performed like the 2008.
Right.
And it was
Red
like,
Bull and Williams, right?
Williams,
also had it too, but
yeah.
Braun just came out just swinging. I mean, they petered out near the end as everyone started catching up.
Everybody caught up,
and Braun didn't have any development at all.
But all the points they scored in the beginning of the season, JB held on to them.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about development races. Braun didn't have one.
They didn't have one.
That's why they came out with that. That's why it's amazing how many points. And we all say, oh, JB's kind of fallen off of it.
Yeah.
No, not really.
Not really.
That certainly affected his psyche, but the other teams started learning and getting with the game, and they just didn't have anything to
Braun didn't have the money to develop in seasons. And Grace is always taking it to JB about the dual diffuser, but I really grew to like JB as he matured in the sport and became such his ability to drive in changing conditions is awesome.
Right.
And he's such a heads up guy, and nobody gives him credit for that. I kind of think, we talked about this in the past about having race vision. JB had it.
Yeah.
He saw the whole race.
Yeah.
He knew what was going on.
Yep.
And that's what I liked about him. But, he scored all those points and everybody, oh, well, it was the dual diffuser. But, the mental game that he had to go through, knowing that they weren't developing and everybody was out developing, and he had to cling on to that point.
I know, and he lost it a little bit, and he wasn't performing, and then he sucked it up and got the job done. But
he got it done, but that not easy to do mentally as a driver. I think that would be difficult. The other thing I chose was really twofold, because they're two sort of different technologies, but they were very big. Was first the tuned mass damper that Renault ran, and then the J damper. You remember that one that McLaren ran? And if you haven't researched both of those, go research those technologies. I'll just give you a brief recap in my notes here, but definitely go research this because it was really interesting, especially the J damper. Again, another McLaren Ron Dennis innovation.
Nice, Ron.
It was really cool. So first of all, the tuned mass damper was Renault. Now this was revolutionary in 2006. They used a sprung damped mass mounted inside the nose cone, about 9 kilograms, and it helped offset the large sidewall deflections of the real high aspect ratio F1 tires at the time. So this mass damper was so revolutionary, and it got banned, and the FI made them take it off, and it radically changed their fortune that season.
They banned it as an movable aerodynamic
device, some sort of thing like that. Yeah. And it was a shame because it was really innovative, and it radically impacted Renault's performance that year.
Yeah. I mean, that technology still exists.
Yeah.
But in a different manner within damper, design.
Yeah, exactly.
Just that theory, et cetera.
Yeah.
Sure.
It was really revolutionary in that sense. Now McLaren had been working. I wouldn't say that McLaren saw that and said, oh, it's innovative, let's do that. I think McLaren, in fairness to the geniuses in Woking and what they were doing at the time too, is they were running a parallel path with this sort of damper technology. Now, what was cool about what McLaren did with the J damper is McLaren applied the work of Malcolm Smith at the University of Cambridge, and he did this lecture about this system, and he explained the system principles. It was basically making a mechanical system analogous to a passive electrical system. And so his proposal was a dual flywheel set inside the damper body, which was operated by a rack and pinion. And so as forces applied to the endpoints of the device, the flywheels accelerated, producing opposite and equal force. And so what you've got, Paul, is this dire situation, which with like wheel hop in this suspension where the contact patch of the tire is not there momentarily, but you've struggled with it as a professional driver your whole life, going over curbs, right?
Right.
And so they reduced all this through this damper. And so these flywheels were set in there that were working to keep that constantly down,
right,
and improve the grip.
And a lot of this came from what they learned from active cars, actually.
Yeah,
right. And they were trying to bring everything they gained from the active cars somehow passively recreate it somehow. And that's basically what all this stuff was trying to, because they saw what big advantage that active car did. And they were just trying to recreate it somehow. They, as I talked to the guy at the Multimatic, the damper guy there, French Canadian guy, he's awesome. My eyes glaze over after a while, but just amazing. But basically, they design these dampers to fool the car into thinking it's in a state it's not, to try and keep the platform the way they want it to be. Crazy stuff.
Yeah,
Crazy
it's just
stuff.
insane. And I'm not an engineer. I don't understand it. I don't pretend to. I mean, I get the concepts behind it. I think most of you do. But the point is that you don't ever want that contact patch to leave the tarmac, because that's your grip. And that contact patch is small to begin with, right?
Right.
So the more you can get it on there all the time, it's better. So anyway, big innovations in the damper technology for Formula One. That's what I came up with in the 2000s. So finally, we get to 2000, because 2020, it's here. The big impact, COVID-19.
Yeah, we'll just leave that over there.
Yeah, we're just gonna pass that on. But let's talk about the 2010s, if we will. I only had two elements in mind. What were yours?
I had two. I had Liberty Media.
That's
the big,
what I had.
The big
That's
change
one of mine.
of power. And then I had hybrids, well, I guess it's more than one, but hybrids, DRS/HD tires, manipulation of the sport.
What?
Show.
It's glorious, Paul. You and I both have the same things. I had the hybrid engine and Liberty Media.
There we go.
Yeah,
all right. But it wasn't just hybrid. I said it's like DRS and so I guess I had three technically.
Yeah.
And just the manipulation of the sport, just to spice things up and to change this, and do that, and just stuff we obviously don't like. Even though DRS was part of the original wing design back with the Chaparral, I still hate it equally as much as I ever did.
Yeah. Hybrid. Yeah. So I'm very much. I mean, if you looked at it, remember I said at the beginning of this podcast, you could go back and draw a line about this arc of technology, and we could probably argue all day long about this is when people say that technology has always been a part of F1, and they are correct. There's no doubt about that. It always, and I would never argue that it hasn't been.
Right.
But along with that technology arc, folks, you could argue, well, is it really needed? Where are the pitfalls? Think of what Paul had mentioned about active suspension. They banned it. Traction control. We have that on our road cars, but they banned it in Formula One. And you say, well, okay, but don't dog the hybrid engines. This is the most technically advanced engine that's been, it's true, but active suspension is too. But they banned it in favor of better racing. Right? Better, more entertaining racing.
And cost control. Yeah.
And cost control. That's why they banned it. That's why they banned a lot of things. Turbos, they banned those for cost control. They were trying to control the cost of Formula One because that technology arc became so expensive. Now they found ways to fund it in sponsorship and taking over control of Formula One and all those things. But folks, we are back to a point where they've got to start putting entertainment and banning things for better entertainment and to mitigate the cost control. That's what they're trying to do with cost caps. So if you're new to Formula One, you can see this evolution arc, but realize that, it can't be unfettered because nobody can afford it at this point. And the sport itself has to prune itself. It's like some trees that sort of prune themselves and get rid of their deadwood so they can grow. And that's kind of what has to happen with the sport here. And that's kind of where we are. And if you look at what's going on in 2020, perhaps the 2020s, that will be the big thing that Paul and I are talking about, is that they brought in a cost cap. They went back to a affordable engine, and we got back to good entertaining racing.
Yeah. I mean, we've even talked about before, how do you save money? Well, you don't have a new car every year, and now they're doing that. Because they're having to. Is that going to be something that is going to be commonplace in the future, where you build a chassis and that has to be a chassis for 2 years? That, all these cars, there's all kinds of different ways you can do it, and everything's going to be different. It wasn't the same as in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. It's the new Formula One, and then it's going to be the new Formula One in 2 years' time also. It's just the evolution of the sport, and you can't,
And I get accused. If you're younger, I've had people that are younger, and you're just an old fart, and you're a Luddite, and you're
they blow raspberries at you.
Yeah, and they accuse me of being a boomer. I'm not a boomer, folks. I'm a Gen X.
No, my son calls me a boomer. That's really annoying.
I know. People say, you're I'm not a boomer. I'm a Gen X. I take great. If you're a Gen X, you'll know you take great offense being called a boomer. Stop it. That dog don't hunt, folks. We are not boomers, and we fought pretty hard against that. But I get accused of being like, I'm not. The technology is awesome. If you want me to take the gloves off, I'll say screw it. Hybrids, DRS, HD tires, and bring back traction control, active suspensions, bring back all of that stuff where the driver barely has to drive the car. If that's what you want to do, then I'm game. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not against the technology. I'm saying the technology is now hurting the sport. So the sport has to get in balance. You have to get profitable at whatever level you're selling at. And right now, it ain't selling. So they got to get profitable. And the one way you got to do that is you got to get away from this MGUH. You got to get back to the sport and create entertaining, fun racing. If you're willing to sit around and watch people get pissed off watching a game, then for crying out loud, I don't know what to tell you when you get apoplectic about moving back out of hybrid to a normally aspirated engine. I don't know what to tell you. You'll sit around and watch sim racing and get emotionally invested in that, but come on, man.
We want to see real racing. And there's all kinds of technology that as I've said before, so the technology within the car needs to be simplified. You don't need 50 engineers calling in to see which switch the driver needs to do. Don't put any switches on the steering wheel.
Don't need it.
Give them a stop button, a brake bias, and go, and let the driver deal with how the car evolves. Right now, all they're doing, they've got so many things on the cars to stop the car evolving in a negative manner lap time to kind of fight all those things. We'll just take it out and put it back in the driver's hands, and that once again will actually make the racing better, and the better drivers will show up a little bit clearer on Sundays as well. Saturdays, whenever the hell the races are going to be. I don't know.
Whenever it is. Anyway, all right. We've went through the decades. That's what we think about it. I'm sure you guys all have a good opinion. Let us know what you think. Let us know what your list is. You can do that on any one of our social media channels. On Twitter, it's at the Parc Fermé. On Facebook, we have a Facebook page. Just look for the Parc Fermé. You can share your opinions there. You can go to our webpage and you can share your opinion there. It's theparcferme.com, and just do it with decorum and civility, no personal attacks. If you like the podcast, go over to iTunes, give us some love, give us a good rating over at iTunes. We always appreciate that. And most importantly, we are incredibly grateful for our Patreon supporters. Thank you so much. If you don't want to be a regular Patreon supporter, which you can do for as little as $1 a month, but you like the podcast, you can go over and buy some of our merch. You can buy t-shirts, and if you just go to our website, there's a picture of a t-shirt on the right-hand side. You click on that, you can go buy one of our t-shirts, including our new anagram series, which scrambles up our names and comes up with such innovative slogans as
Farm the Creep.
Farm the Creep, which is Paul's favorite.
Yes.
That's a good one. So you can do that as well. Paul, it's been awesome. Thank you for bailing me out on the podcast and giving me a good topic. I appreciate it.
Well, once a year I'll put in a little extra work,
Grace always says you two just show up and podcast, and that's true. But we underestimate your contribution to this podcast. You've given us great ideas over the years, so it's been great. So it's been fantastic. So all right, well, hopefully we'll be back. Also, for your Patreon supporters, just FYI, if you haven't seen it and you're a Patreon supporter, I did post this. You can go back and watch it. But the rest of you can watch it too. But the only people that get to do a TPF live session with us and share and actually chat with us and ask questions and interact are our Patreon supporters. So we did one of those. Paul and I did.
Yeah, it was good fun.
A few days ago. It was great fun. And you guys can come on, you ask us questions, you contribute to the conversation, and we had a great time. So if you've considered about being a Patreon supporter, that's one good reason to do that, because when we do those TPF live sessions, we had a lot of fun. But I did post to that. You can see that on our YouTube channel and on our website. So we had a great conversation, didn't we?
Yes, we did. Yeah, great questions. It was fun. Yeah, it's fun to be instantly, hey, man, that's right. That's a great question. Now I got to think of a great answer.
Right. Yeah, it puts us on the spot. I mean, it's great doing the podcast, but when we do those live sessions, it's so cool to be interacting in real time with you guys and being able to share your thoughts interactively with us. It's great fun. So we enjoy it. So, all right, until next week when we come back to do it all over again, this is Todd, AKA Negative Camber, saying so long.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over.